Fundamentalism connotes the imposition of a single interpretation of religious doctrine and hostility towards contradiction or plurality. Religious fundamentalists often romanticize a pure past or tradition and present it as an overarching solution to contemporary social problems. Religious fundamentalisms are global political projects. The goals of these projects vary, but there are broad commonalities. Thus, the plural term religious fundamentalisms better describes the phenomenon. Because these are political in nature, religious fundamentalisms cannot be separated from other fundamentalist movements that are based on ethnicity, nationality, and culture. Religious fundamentalisms are also closely associated with other forms of intolerance such as racism, sexism, homophobia, and elitism. Thus, despite the insistence on a single religious doctrine as the only true doctrine, alliances are formed between conservatives from various religious traditions. For example, in November 2004, Catholic, Muslim, and US-based Christian fundamentalists met in Doha to discuss a united opposition to feminist interventions in the United Nations. The alliance has worked in the UN through Arab governments, mainly in Qatar. Fundamentalisms are reactions against the alienation, loss of identity, violence, and economic hardships brought about by capitalist exploitation. Fundamentalisms are also implicated in the power shifts that have brought about the possibility of neoliberal globalization. Indeed, feminists and anti-globalization political theorists have argued that economic neoliberalism can be classified as a fundamentalism. Here also, singular interpretations of economic theory and one-size-fits-all economic prescriptions mark the terrain. Even in the academe, economists who go against the neoliberal orthodoxy have been ostracized. Similarly, the legitimization of neoliberal globalization is accomplished with the consent of national governments, which do not necessarily represent their people. In truth, governments often represent the interests of patriarchal elites. Here again, there is failure to take cognizance of the democratic and egalitarian impulses of a diverse society. The theoretical underpinnings of neoliberal economics also make patriarchal assumptions about women and female sexuality. For all its complexity, fundamentalisms are a major threat to women worldwide. The reason for this is that the control of women is a feature of religious fundamentalisms. It is arguably the most consistent feature. This is related to another central feature of fundamentalisms, the establishment of an identity for its adherents. Thus, national, ethnic, religious fundamentalisms use women and their bodies as markers to define insiders and outsiders. Because women serve as markers for their group, rape and sexual violence become an assault on their family or their entire community. An example is the rape and forced impregnation that accompanied the ethnic cleansing associated with the war in ex-Yugoslavia. The near universality of patriarchal control of women as a feature of fundamentalisms deserves deep analysis. Even those who recognize this commonality argue that fundamentalisms are best understood when analysis is done at the level of the contextual and the concrete. Thus, the consistent patriarchal character of religious and other fundamentalisms must be balanced with the need for contextual analysis. At the level of feminist theory, this repositions problematics for feminist postmodernism and identity politics. Religious fundamentalisms can only be explained by an analysis that does not take the productive economy and the state as the main sources of political power. Such reductionist views cannot explain how fundamentalisms adapt to a plethora of micro and macro situations and use power sources inside and outside the state to affect people's lives. On the other hand, a completely relativist view of power that understands only its nomadic and capillary aspects cannot explain the consistency by which fundamentalisms uphold systems of oppression such as patriarchy and neoliberal globalization. As has been previously noted, struggles around national, racial, tribal, and religious identity mark fundamentalist projects. These show that identities are socially constructed, multiple, and fluid. The problem with religious fundamentalisms lies in the fact that women are coerced into affirming only their identity as members of certain communities to the detriment of their identity as individual women. The problem is further complicated when national laws and international politics allow exceptions to human rights standards under the guise of multiculturalism or respect for national sovereignty. Both within nations and between nations, practices such as enforced marriage, genital mutilation, stoning for sexual misconduct are often tolerated under the guise of respect for cultural difference. The fallacy in these interpretations is that despite women's desires to identify themselves with certain communities, people within these communities have different interpretations as to what this identification means. To fail to recognize the egalitarian and democratic struggles being waged within identity reinforces the fascism and intolerance of fundamentalist projects. Indeed, theoreticians point to the deeper integration of the social and the biological aspects of production and political control in the era of globalization. In order to adequately explain fundamentalisms, it is necessary to look at theories that integrate desire and the political economy. For example, in his attempt to posit all desire as primordially social rather than individual, Guattari postulates a theory of collectivity that explains the persistence of fascism and intolerance. Guattari makes a distinction between the subjected group and the group subject. While the subjected group defines itself as a reaction to other groups, the group subject seeks to define its own internal dynamics as it interacts with other groups. The subjected group enforces traditional concepts, roles, and power structures and struggles against reformulations of desire. Such a group forms fantasies around a permanent object, such as an eternal God, thus granting itself immortality. The group subject, on the other hand, opens itself to redefinitions and new modes of interaction. The group subject still forms fantasies, but around transient objects that are transcended by actions that open up new boundaries, new fantasies, and therefore new definitions of desire and identity. Guattari extends this analysis by pointing out that group phenomena such as racism and regionalism are examples of the subjected group processes. Furthermore, he sees the capitalist state as a repressive mechanism that prevents the emergence of group-subject processes that threaten it. Empirical evidence can be found to support the argument for religious tolerance. The World Values Survey, begun in 1981, is an ongoing project that looks at political and sociocultural change currently in 62 countries. It has thus become an important indicator of changes over time and across cultures. Using the survey data, Wessel notes that despite wide variations in people's orientations, these can be reduced to just two basic dimensions: weak versus strong secular rational values and weak, strong self-expression values. Secular rational values would include less emphasis on religion and national pride, more emphasis on independent thinking rather than respect for authorities, and the acceptance of divorce. Self-expression values include the enjoyment of civil and political rights, tolerance of nonconformity, such as acceptance of homosexuality, strong sense of self-direction, the public expression of sentiments, and the ability to trust others. Wessel argues that where self-expression and secular rational values are strong, there is a move towards choice. When the two dimensions are weak, there is a move towards constraint. Wessel concludes that moving from constraint to choice is necessary to human development because it makes people mentally free and allows them to develop their potentials. At a social level, Wessel also notes that the move towards choice generates a potential for democratic reform. Wessel's data also charts countries along the two dimensions, revealing a trend towards choice and democracy in countries which achieve higher levels of economic well-being. However, secularism is also a term that needs to be unpacked in order for it to be politically useful. Vivian Weaver notes that secularism does not automatically mean modernity, equal rights, or individualism. She uses Confucianism, for example, as a secular philosophy that justifies patriarchy as the highest form of statecraft. Another example of a modern patriarchal secular philosophy is fascism. The term secularism also has come to denote a variety of concepts and social practices. Differences in the way secularism is practiced show that moral and cultural considerations affect public policy. Feminists attempt to affect public policy just as much as other sectors when we fight for the implementation of women's rights. Human rights, gender equality, social justice, environmentalism are also moral values. Additionally, many people fighting for the same values do so out of the conviction that this is the correct way of living their religious beliefs. Nonetheless, we need to posit secularism as a tool against fundamentalisms in a way that supports democratic aspirations. In this light, An-Naim proposes the concept of secularism as mediation. Citizens must be able to propose and advocate policy and legislative initiatives on the basis of their religious belief. But such proposals must be within the context of reasoning that is acceptable to those who do not subscribe to that particular religion. Also, public policy must be crafted and implemented in such a way that allows all citizens to accept, amend, or reject the policy as a matter of individual conscience. Such policies must include standards of non-discrimination and protection of the minority against the tyranny of the majority. Bagyonay approaches the concept from his experiences as a gay lesbian rights scholar and activist working in Catholic Latin America. Bagyonay notes that the Catholic Church straddles both theological and secular dimensions when it opposes reproductive and sexual rights. Bagyonay proposes that this dual nature of the Catholic Church's discourse must be addressed effectively if it is to be counteracted. First, final interpretation of doctrine cannot be left to the Catholic Church. Secondly, or its hierarchy. Secondly, the Church must be confronted in secular spaces for its bigotry and unscientific arguments. Bagyonay thus proposes the concept of religious dissidence as another area that complements the call for secularism. French Muslim scholar Benchek argues that separation is good for religions because it returns religion to its original state, which is that of belief adopted out of pure conviction without fear or force.